Jeden.
Szanowni Państwo, witam serdecznie po
Gentlemen, welcome back after 30 minutes break. Let's continue our international conference, Countryside Against Communism in Eastern and Central Europe and Russia in 20th centuries. First panel has ended already. A very interesting topic of introduction of communism in Russia and politics of the Soviet regime vis-a-vis the rural population and in the Soviet Russia. So currently we have we're ahead of the second panel. Countryside Against Communism in Central and Eastern Europe in the years 1944-1989. So we have a slight modification resulting from unexpected events. Namely, we have one foreign panelist, even though everyone confirmed their participation. We do hope that in the course of discussion they will join us. We have Dr. Jiri from the Czech Republic. I will introduce him in a moment. And Professor Dariusz Jarosz agreed to be the speaker or the panelist together with Dr. Urban, and they will discuss the changes in the countryside in the Central and Eastern Europe. So I would like to thank Professor Jarosz for responding to the situation in such a positive manner. I know that it is a bit actually problematic because we did not actually informed him beforehand. I hope that it's going to be some very interesting discussion. Let me now officially introduce our guest, Dr. Jiri, who is the historian, the graduate of the contemporary history at University of Pardubice. As of 2005, he's been dealing with the regional research of the Czech collectivization of the rural areas. He is an author of an important book, Countryside under the collectivization and the circumstances of the collapse process. And he's also the author of the publication in Czech language about the collectivization of the river. And he's co-author of other publications and books devoted to the agro and communist history of Czechoslovakia. He's an author of many publications devoted to the communist totalitarian regime and the resistance against the forced mass collectivization. We are happy to have Dr. with us. We also have Professor Jarosz. I don't need to introduce him, but let me just say he's outstanding Polish historian, expert of the social history and the promoter of this trend in Polish historiography. He is the expert in the agro topics and many also other, he's an expert of many other important topics, the author of topics around the Polish Republic of Poland, sorry. So briefly, what are we going to discuss now? Gentlemen will refer to three main issues, let's say thematic blocks. The first one devoted to the introduction, implementation of the Soviet model and the course of collectivization in the individual countries. In this case, Dr. Urban will discuss the situation in Czechoslovakia, Professor Jarosz will discuss the situation of Poland, and we are going to discuss why collectivization succeeded in Czechoslovakia, but did not succeed in Poland. So this will be the main actually axis of this discussion, the main point for the discussion here. Then the results of collectivization in the economic and social perspective, cultural perspective as well. And the third thematic block, the issue related to attitude of the inhabitants of rural areas, mainly peasants, the adaptation, cooperation, or maybe resistance against the government. We will also discuss the level of involvement in the official active action supporting government and anti-governmental actually active the actions actually in the countryside. So this is the outline of the discussions, and after each and every thematic block, I would encourage all the participants to raise their questions or to share their comments, to make their own interventions in the discussion. So whoever would like to participate, please raise hand. We have the icon of a yellow hand. I will then give you floor. You will be able to ask questions or participate in the discussion. So I hope everything is crystal clear. Let's move on to the first topic. Well, Professor mentioned the interpretation as well. A very important aspect. We have the option of following the interpretation. At the bottom of the screen, you can find the icon interpretation globe, and actually click on English. You will be able to hear the English, sorry, the Polish version, because Dr. Urban will talk English, I suppose. That's what we agreed. And Professor... So I would prefer to make my interventions in Polish. So we have to switch between the languages Polish and English. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the agenda for this panel. I would like to ask both panelists actually to speak, not to speak too fast. Please slow down, make pauses actually to enable interpreters interpreting context. So, implementation of the Soviet model and collectivization of agriculture in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, as well as Western territories of the Soviet Union that were included after the war to the Soviet Union. For instance, the land of the pre-war Polish state. So what was the implementation like? So how it happened, what was the specificity of the individual countries, whether there were any differences in implementation of the Soviet model depending on the culture, economic specificity, or the attitudes of the rural population in individual states. Over to Dr. Jiri Urban.
Wyłączony ma pani mikrofon, panie Urban.
Mikrofon, tak. Trzeba włączyć mikrofon.
Urban, your microphone is off.
Thank you for the invitation, and good afternoon to everybody. If we should speak about specifics of collectivization in Czechoslovakia, I would start with the elections in May 1946, because at the time Communist Party of Czechoslovakia won the elections, clearly set, especially in Czech and Moravian and Silesian part of former Czechoslovakia, and the election agitation was based on the several promises of keeping possibility of private farming. It's necessary to say that the Ministry of Agriculture was controlled as well as Ministry of Interior by the communists. At the Ministry of Agriculture was communist Julius Jiri, from the more radical wing of Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. And other, let's say, important point it's necessary to say that due to agreements between Czechoslovak and Soviet Communist in Moscow, and later, thanks to government program signed in Košice in spring 1945, the traditional agrarian party, which was included in all governments during the first Czechoslovak Republic, was banned. So it was a very important moment, because the other political subjects, let's say, in the National Front, when opposition was banned, were at the time sure that the inheritance, that they will be able to inherit it, the voters of former agrarian party. They also had a major say in the most important agriculture organization. At the time, it was the Union of Czech Farmers, and they also had their representatives in numerous agriculture institutions of the time. As I already mentioned, Communist Party was full of promises. After the war, they promised everything, almost everything, to everybody, agitated and gave what was not theirs to give. At this point, I have in mention that they seduced farmers into joining the party, promising them the land, originally German land, or German dwellers' land from a borderland of Czechoslovakia, and with the proclamation that the private farming on the private owned land will be possible, and is counted with it for the next years. Communist Party won the elections. I don't know if I should continue now to next step of collectivization, or we will, let's say, compare this post-war period.
Each of you will have up to 15 minutes to present the answers to the one of the main topics for discussion.
Okay.
So you can continue now up to 15 minutes, and then Professor Jarosz will respond to what you have said. Okay.
Okay. I was counting with let's say other scenario, but thanks to that we are just to connected. So after winning the elections in May 1946, Communist Party continue to ensure the countryside about the rights I already mentioned, even after communists took took power monopoly in February 1948. Even then, in constitution from May of that year, the owning and private farming on the land till 50 hectares were guaranteed by constitution, but as we know, just on the paper. Other quite specific and important point for Czechoslovak history was quite rich and deeply rooted cooperative tradition. Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, later called process of collectivization, modeled on Soviet pattern, so-called cooperativization. This was a well thought out rhetoric which was supposed to imply alleged connection to the monetary market, machinery, electrification, water, meliorization, and so on, cooperative projects which were widely spread in the country, mostly during the first Czechoslovak Republic, but rooted already in last 2 decades of 19th century, when the Czech lands were part of Austria-Hungary. Organizations which were established according to the Act about Unified Agriculture Cooperatives from February 1948, is necessary to say, and they were called JZD in Czech, Jednotné zemědělské družstvo. So I will use this time abbreviation JZD. So it's necessary to say that these organizations had nothing to do with the principles of cooperative farming, such as volunteer participation, cooperative self-administration, and member shares reflecting the shares or the share of responsibility. Socialistic production companies in form of JZDs were fully controlled by state, like state farms, were subject to bureaucratic system of organization and, of course, centrally planned economy. Communist state and the command economy defined the production plans, inputs and outputs as well, prices of sold and bought goods, market supplies, as well as the internal organization and the amount of farmed land. To sum up, we can say that JZDs in Czechoslovakia were in fact no cooperatives, although the name was carefully chosen to evoke the idea of cooperatives. There's a huge difference between unified agriculture cooperatives and volunteer cooperatives. I think must be remembered in order to prevent confusing collectivization and cooperativization.
Could you just tell us a little bit about the local specificity of the Czechoslovakian collectivization, the Czechoslovakian model of the communist agriculture?
Yeah, okay, I will move on. I just wanted to say that the main slogans of the Communist Party was ensure the voters that there will be no collectivization according to the Soviet model in Czechoslovakia. But it was just promises. After the spring, and already mentioned Unified Agriculture Cooperatives Act from February 1949. Collectivization in Czech lands was launched, and agitation campaign started. In the next 2 years, the current trends in agriculture policy and their implementation were often presented by Rudolf Slansky during February sessions of the General Committee of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. The adopted measures to promote collectivization were getting harder and started a circle of repressions aimed at independent private farmers. It was only in the latter half of the year 1953 that Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, due to pressure of social as well as economic problems, decided to, let's say, tone down its agriculture policies. However, any hope for return to decent conditions of private farming, independent private farming, ended abruptly in June 1955 when Antonín Novotný, first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia at the time, and clearly stated that the future of Czechoslovak agriculture lies exclusively in JZDs and state farms. The temporary stagnation, we can say, in collectivization was replaced by an next offensive, which caused that a vast majority of farmers resign and gave in to the pressure of collectivization. The communist government then gained full control of the production and supplies of groceries. So it's, let's say, schematically described and now.
But I've got another question to you. Why do you think the implementation of the Soviet model of agriculture in Czechoslovakia turned out to be successful? What's your opinion? Please.
Thanks to the pressure, of course, because at this time we can mention, of course, opposition towards collectivization, because people in the country were definitely unhappy and disillusioned and resisted to collectivization. The most common way of protest were verbal, but the opposition against collectivization resulted in disrupted meetings, the distribution of flyers, organized, let's say, signing actions against entering the JZDs or state farms. Farmers were especially unhappy about the forced so-called sales of agriculture machinery. It was more than sales of oh, I don't have the right word in English now. I'm sorry. So I will continue. Villages were restless and torn from inside. On the other hand, communist functionaries and agitators had their window broken, tires cut. They received threatening letters. Vulgar inscription appeared on their houses and homes and so forth. Hiding the real amount of urban land, sabotating the harvest, fires in JZD buildings, damaged machinery and new settlers leaving farmsteads in the border areas of Czechoslovakia. All these were inseparable parts of that collectivization period. Members of peasant families, mostly the young generation, were also active in resistant groups. The opposition against collectivization on the side of farmers was gradually broken by continuous political agitation together with violence, repressions, and imprisonment.
Thank you very much. And now let's ask Professor Jarosz about the Polish experience of collectivization implementation and the results of this process in Poland. Panie profesorze, zapraszamy teraz pana profesora Jarosza.
Professor Jarosz, the floor is yours. Let me say a few words about Polish experience, but well, during these 5-10 minutes time, I got ready for this broader discussion of collectivization of Eastern Europe. So, as Dr. Urban said, was extremely interesting because it presented the Czech experience. But how this Polish and well, I would like to take this Polish and Czech experience and I would like to confront it with the broader perspective. So looking at the basic aspects of collectivization, when it started, when it got stopped, when it ended. So we can see a certain typical differences. In the Soviet Union, collectivization started in 1929, as we all know. There was a slowdown in 1931. That was the article published that played a certain role here. And the end of collectivization, 1935 up to 1940 in some regions, without, of course, the Baltic states of the Soviet Union, where collectivization, as we know, started in 1947. And that ended, well, it is assumed that it ended in 1950. In all countries of the Soviet bloc, there were elements of the beginning of collectivization and slowdowns as well. So the local versions of the Stalin's article, the headache of the success, and afterwards there was a slowdown of the process of collectivization happening. In Poland, these were several stages. I will discuss them in a moment. Before that, however, let me refer to the beginning of collectivization. Beginning of collectivization is usually associated with the Cominform session of June 38, and this was, let me remind you that that was the moment when there was a decision taken to collectivize the whole Eastern Europe. In fact, however, it actually started in a majority of the Soviet bloc countries in the years 1948-49. In Czechoslovakia, it was 1949, in Hungary 48, in Romania 49, 2009 in Yugoslavia. It started as of 1948, and there are two countries that actually started collectivization at the earlier stage. Bulgaria were the first cooperatives actually appeared in 1944-48, and Albania, first kolkhoz, actually appeared in 1946. It is also an interesting actually case of the Germany where collectivization started as late as 1952. It was resulted or it was related to this international situation of Germany and the attitude of Stalin towards the German problem. In the beginning of the 1952, Stalin did not know how the German question will be solved. Maybe the Eastern Germany were supposed to be connected with the Western Germany, etc. So in 1952, Stalin decided that the Eastern Germany remain Eastern part of Germany, and the collectivization should start then. So this process started 1952, and it is assumed that collectivization there ended in 1960. In other parts of the Soviet bloc, the collectivization, beginning of, or end of, sorry, collectivization came to different, actually fall in different years. In Czechoslovakia 1960, Hungary 61, Romania 62, Bulgaria 59, Albania probably actually in 1967. Probably I'm saying because the information about Albania and anything that happened there is quite scarce, so pretty limited. So just to structure this collectivization process in Europe or Central Eastern Europe, so that we all know the broader context. As I already said, Cominform and their decision actually was the key moment for collectivization, and all this the Eastern Bloc countries followed the Soviet model of collectivization. What was it all about? It was about assumption of the framework statutes of the cooperatives. There were various statutes and various number of statutes. We assumed that in Poland in the beginning we had 3 of them, and then it was supplemented by the 4th type of the cooperative. They differed in terms of actually level of socialization of this collective firms. So this was one of the elements of this Soviet model of collectivization. The second model was also very important, namely, in a very specific way, the agriculture was mechanized. So as of 47 in Poland, the Polish machinery centers have been developed, and they more or less actually followed these MTS, the Soviet MTS machine centers, where there were basic machines, tractors that were supposed actually to harvest the land of the production cooperatives, and only then individual farmers, if only they wanted to do that. So these are the important elements of these state-owned machinery centers. The important element of them was actually the political division that existed there. So similarly as in the Soviet Union, these political divisions, they were supposed actually to convince farmers to join the cooperatives. Moment of beginning of collectivization in Poland relates directly to the changes of government. So after Gomułka is leaving the power, and actually the new political leader becomes Bolesław Bierut, and it all impacts collectivization as well. Gomułka, of course, as the typical communist, he was not opposing the collectivization. However, he perceived the pace of collectivization totally differently. Gomułka actually have seen collectivization in pre-war period during his visits to Moscow. He was not a supporter actually of the quick pace of collectivization, whereas the new party leaders supported by Stalin, they wanted actually to implement the collectivization of countryside in Poland as soon as possible. So already at the meeting in 1949 in autumn, the first resolutions, first decisions on the collective farms actually were adopted. This was supposed to be actually the beginning of the collectivization of the Polish rural areas. So already then the methods were, specific methods were adopted. It was a certain paradox because on the one hand, the back then propaganda mentioned that joining the cooperative should be a deed of will of a farmer. On the other hand, however, the number of collective farms have been planned already then. So at the end of 1938, the first production cooperatives have been established, and the first ones actually were, or majority of them basically, these were the basic types of the production cooperatives, and not all the elements of the farm holdings were actually given to the cooperative, and not all the, let's say, labor forces were devoted to cooperatives. So this was one element, and we have to remember that collectivization of countryside, that's on the one hand side, the creation of the production farms, on the other hand, the obligatory compulsory supplies of food. This is also the element of the process of the collectivization. The fact that the compulsory supplies of basic food products actually were smaller for farms and bigger for individual farm holds. This fact proves, and this is the evidence, how the collectivization happened, what was actually the philosophy behind it in Poland. And this was also creating certain created certain distortions of collectivization, because soon it appeared, it turned out that Polish peasants are reluctant to collectivization, and we will discuss it later. Therefore, it was necessary to force Polish farmers to join such cooperatives. So this compulsory food supplies was an important factor and element of creation of the production cooperatives. In practice, the local political leaders actually realized that farmers are against such production farms. Therefore, as they are so reluctant, they must be forced to join cooperatives. Therefore, it created a certain elements of the coercion or the pressure on the local level. So it created a local conflict between the local authorities and the peasants who did not want to join the production farm holdings. So this was the most important context of the collectivization. First, distortion in the party line, as it was used to say, happened in Gryfice region in 1951. So that was the Western Pomerania region, and in fact, these were the local brigades of the young people. While searching for grain, they were, of course, searching for grain in the individual farmholds. They were actually stealing or taking this grains away, destroying these farms. All this actually was reported to the Central Political Committee, and there was, of course, these methods of creation of production cooperatives in Gryfice were condemned, and that was quite interesting. As of that moment, as of that time, when the Central Committee decided on this to condemn actually act in Gryfice. So in whole Poland, then there were the party meetings organized. There were like sittings of the local party committees, and following actually Gryfice legal act, the other distortions in our problems in other regions were acknowledged. So the documents that remain from that times, this is a great source of actually knowing more about the reality of collectivization in 1951 and until 1916 in Poland. So it was allowed actually to criticize the local party leaders. So we may say that in 1950-51, creation of the production cooperatives with the forced actually administrative methods was not an exception, it was a rule. And we have actually a range of documents and the local resolutions confirming this thesis.
So did anything change insofar as creating production cooperatives? For sure, for a certain period, from summer 1951 for some months up until early autumn, the speed of production cooperatives or the creation of such cooperatives goes down. But very soon it turned out that the creation of cooperatives by voluntary measures is impossible because peasants do not want cooperatives. Therefore, despite the fact that these methods of creating the cooperatives was discounted, after the months they went back to these methods, to the methods that were discounted. This is a paradox, but it results. Professor, I have a question. Sorry, I didn't hear the question. The collectivization in Poland didn't succeed for two reasons. First was the peasantry resistance, and I hope that I'll be able to talk about it, a very strong one, decisive. And on the other hand, it seems to me that a certain unwillingness to create a conflict with authorities in the party apparatus. It seems to me that without the second underappreciated element, well, I think that this resistance, non-open resistance, or rather this unwillingness, the conviction that it's better not to do it and not exaggerate it, that it was very popular in the party. Lack of consequence or consistence of the government as far as the creating of the cooperatives, it was resulting in such a situation that the party was disoriented. Besides that, Polish peasantry and Polish society managed to reach the time of the October transformations, the first death of Stalin, without mass collectivization. It seems to me that the combination of two factors, so resistance and on the other hand lack of willingness to create collectivization through the party apparatus, this resulted in the fact that collectivization in Poland didn't happen. Although if we read different about different conversations that were happening in the 60s and 70s between Polish and Soviet party members,
mieli pretensje, jeżeli chodzi o tak zwane budownictwo socjalistyczne w Polsce.
The Russians, the Soviets were complaining about the situation in Poland because the collectivization was not carried out, despite the fact that there is a very strong church, which is the natural support for the opposition. Always non-collectivization of agriculture under Khrushchev and Brezhnev was listed as an important element of this different model of socialism in the Soviet version in Poland.
Dziękuję, panie profesorze.
Thank you, Professor.
A proszę powiedzieć, czy w latach 60.
Could you tell us if in the 60s and 70s
potem ekipa Gierka w ogóle poważnie
Gomułka and Gierek team were thinking about collectivization seriously, because there were some steps taken towards that. Yeah, there was socialization of certain elements of agriculture, but they never went back to the idea of collectivization. What you are thinking about, I think, is to trying to make peasants be accustomed to certain ideas, like there were different clubs, for example, agrarian clubs for the farmers, simply speaking, so that part of the money coming from the compulsory deliveries of foodstuffs, there should be some centers or clubs where using machines would be happening in a team manner, collective manner. If we are talking about Gierek period, we are talking about giving some of the peasants' land to the cooperatives. So this was an attempt to do it, but they didn't succeed. And I think that in the second half of the 70s, it was something which started to play ever smaller role as perspective of agriculture. Polish authorities knew that Polish peasantry, insofar as the future of agriculture, are very unwilling to create cooperatives, and we can see it in sociological research. When Polish peasants were answering the question about the future of agriculture, usually they were talking about individual farms, and it was very rare that they talked about cooperatives. So this proves what a trauma was collectivization for Polish countryside. And another question to Mr. Jiri Orban about the first thematic block. If on the crisis of during the Prague Spring, was there very serious attempts to return to individual farming at that time, against the wishes of the authorities, of course?
Thank you for this question about Prague Spring. I would say that for Czech or Czechoslovak countryside, Prague Spring and whole year 1968 was by no means such a revolutionary year like for the urban population. After experiencing the forced collectivization experiments coming from the towns, from as the country dwellers perceived experiment coming from the towns in form of collectivization as well as industrialization. The country was rather, I would say, reserved concerning the hopes for democratization and ideals of Prague Spring at all. 19 years after the collectivization started, the situation in agriculture was quite stabilized. We should say the agriculture production started to grow again after more than 20 years after the war. Primarily thanks to mechanization, the people in the country had learned how to live under the new regime and got accustomed to it. So we can talk about accommodation in this new collectivized situation in the countryside. The most active village representative became during the Prague's spring, became founders of district agriculture associations, which often emerged from transformed production agriculture administration later. In the early years of the occupation, district agriculture administrations and the Union of Cooperative Farmers as so-called mass social organization of cooperative peasants controlled by the state were established on their platform. We can say that huge number of farmers which were or who were persecuted during the collectivization period closely followed the activities of the club of former political prisoners, K 231. The number is related to the number of the act for defense of the republic, was one of the main act for political persecution after the February 48. Most active and previously persecuted farmers became members of its local offices and demanded rehabilitations. Rehabilitation Act was actually passed in July 1968, and the rehabilitation process started, but after the occupation, not immediately, but during first 12 months, let's say, the opened rehabilitation processes were stopped, closed, or abandoned.
May I ask you another question? Wait a moment, please. Chciałbym zapytać, czy ktoś z Państwa uczestniczących w konferencji chciałby zadać jakieś pytania do tego bloku tematycznego?
About this thematic block to our speakers. Maybe Professor Robert Kuśnierz, please. Just a short question to you gentlemen, related in a way to my discipline. I used to deal with the work system, labor system in the Soviet colcos, and there was a kind of a table for every worker, every colcos worker, what you have to do to have a full work day. So work days were counted, and in order to include one work day, you had to work for several days, for dozen plus days, because for instance, the weather was bad and you couldn't plow the land. So this is what it looked like at the beginning phase of collectivization. I'm wondering, would it look like in Poland or Czechoslovakia or other countries? This is my question. How it was calculated? Would any one of you like to answer? Yes, I confirm that in Poland there was also the system. They tried to introduce a limit of those calculation days. I don't remember in which type, third type, you had to work for 100 days. That was a minimum for the cooperative to be functioned properly. This system was also introduced in Poland, and valuation of the works was always a problem because there were some works that were valuated better and you could get less tired, and there are also those that were worse. And this problem appeared during meetings. And now, Mr. Jiri Urban, would you like to answer this question from Professor Kuśnierz?
If I understood correctly, you are asking just about if in Czechoslovakia the system of work days was also functioning or introduced.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, of course. The system of work days, work units was introduced. In Czechoslovakia, it was connected with. There were 4 levels of cooperation in JZDs. First 2 levels were, let's say, skipped at least at 1951 or 2. And starting by 3rd level of JZD, it was connected with plowing the limits and common cattle breeding and so on. So in this 3rd level of JZD and 4th as well, the introduction of that system of work days already started. So it wasn't limited by the certain period or certain year in Czechoslovak collectivization history, but in the level of cooperation in the JZD.
Czy pan profesor jest usatysfakcjonowany odpowiedzią?
Jak najbardziej, dziękuję. Dowiedziałem.
Are you satisfied with the answer? Yeah, of course. I've learned something new, what it looked like somewhere else, not only in the Soviet Union. All right, thank you very much. And now we'll move to the second thematic block, namely, let's talk about the results of the collectivization and the introduction of the Soviet collectivization model in CEE countries. And the first question, a tricky question in a way. There were positive effects of collectivization. You always say that it was a catastrophe, a disaster for agriculture, but let's remember that the agriculture of CEE countries, especially Eastern countries, was very much backwards, and one of the main reasons why this region was backwards. So were there positive effects of collectivization, and if not, what were the most important effects? Professor Jarosz, please. All right, let's start with the mechanization. You are saying that this was a positive effect of collectivization, so the mechanization of agriculture. Of course, the mechanization was a doctrinal assumption of collectivization. They tried to introduce the Soviet model when the machines farming machines are supposed to prove the superiority of collective farming above the traditional farming. But the problem with this in the 50s is that these machines, as I've said, were in the state machine centers. This is where they were gathered. It's not that every cooperative could buy a machine, more or less complicated farming machine. It was supposed to be happening. The transfer of it was supposed to happen through those state machine centers. The symbol of the mechanization of agriculture was the tractor. The tractor was supposed to be this machine, the classical machine that was seen on propaganda films, Soviet propaganda films, and this was the symbol of mechanization. But the symbol of mechanization, there is a basic problem related to that, which is that they tried to compare the effects of the work in the cooperatives that were tapping into the work of tractors and machines in those where they used to use horses. And it turned out that wherever they had a lot of horses, they were used for farming works. So the effectiveness of such cooperatives was much greater. This resulted from the fact that the tractors were breaking down very quickly, that it was very difficult to decide what is the plan for the tractors to come whenever they were necessary to be used for basic farming works. All these problems related to machines and with this type of machines that were adopted were so big that they resulted in the fact that these cooperatives that were using the traditional labor force, which were horses, had better effects. And the conclusion of this research, this is research from the 50s, the conclusion of this research were known to the party authority, party management, and they knew that this model of mechanization which has been adopted is not fully working well. What were the results of collectivization? Well, the results of collectivization in Poland, and I'm talking about Poland right now because I know that example better, in economic terms were very bad. Collectivization meant not only creating a production cooperative, but a certain peculiar approach to the big farms, and this approach was related with the fact that the number of obligatory deliveries was exceeding their capabilities, economic capabilities. It was called economic dead body or economic corpse, and these were these big farms. And it turned out that this dimension of obligatory supplies of deliveries and different types of taxation obligation, all that was destructing big farms. And this was an aware policy because it was an ideological model that was adopted from the Soviet Union. Therefore, this is one of the reasons. Besides that, production plans very often existed only on paper. They were created in party statistics, but in fact they didn't exist. Production cooperatives, well, you didn't work very well in them. Like this work days were not really fulfilled, so it's difficult to expect that the effectiveness or the performance of these cooperatives would be big. It was varied. It depended on the region. Some regions had it better, some worse. But production cooperatives also. Well, these cooperatives were developing in Poland in various regions in different ways because of the structure
In central Poland, that was dominated by the small holdings, the cooperatives were not actually effective. They were specifically ineffective. So we are talking about the countryside where the rural structure was fragmented. They were extremely inefficient. The process of creation of the production cooperatives did not mean that the whole village actually joined the cooperative on one day. Often, the cooperatives were joined by individual farmers in a given village, and often they had actually, their land was actually scattered in various areas of the village or outside the village. So to make such cooperative efficient and effective, it was necessary to create the cooperative massives. So the land that would be in one piece belonging to those farmers who actually joined the cooperative, production cooperative. But ladies and gentlemen, it was extremely complicated process. So if you wanted to become the member of cooperative, and if you had actually the land scattered in various pieces, how was it possible actually? How to create such a cooperative land mass? As of 1949, it was actually allowed to swap lands. So the land of the cooperative members were taken from the cooperative and swapped actually with the land that was actually somewhere outside the village. And that created a lot of conflicts in the village, because this land actually who joined the cooperative was usually a better land to the one that actually was taken out of the village, of the cooperative. And that actually the whole model was forcing farmers to join cooperatives. That was the purpose actually behind the whole process, to swap land, you know, the better land to join the cooperative into the worse quality of land that were taken out from such a cooperative farm holding. So it was a very complicated, complex process. That's why actually in terms of agriculture, these agrar politics, the processes that I outlined were the most important ones, and they actually demonstrate what the cooperative actually meant for the agricultural systems. And we may say that the creation of the cooperatives did not actually help the development of agriculture. There was a reluctance of farmers against the cooperatives, and actually reluctance vis-a-vis or against the methods used. In October 1956 in Poland, we had approximately 11,000 of the production cooperatives. After the Gomułka statement in 58, there was a mass process of dissolving actually the cooperatives, and end of 1956 there were like only plus or minus more or less 2,000 cooperatives left. So that this all shows actually how big the reluctance of farmers was. Yet another issue, social result of the collectivization, the reluctance towards the agricultural sector. So many farmers noticed that actually agriculture is not a future for their kids because of the collectivization. So this is yet another actually stimulus actually for people who are leaving countryside, moving to the cities. And this was the typical kind of situation in in Poland. Along with the progressive collectivization, farmers were pushing actually their children out to move to the cities to achieve better life conditions, to the ones actually that they would achieve actually having stayed in the countryside. Yet another aspect important during collectivization was actually increase of so far small group, the working farmers, because of the industrialization that actually progressed in the 1950s, many jobs were created and many actually farmers started to join or to combine work at their small farms and work for the big industrial companies. So that was also an important social economic process that happened then. So basically it happened along with the collectivization. It also showed the broader context of collectivization as a certain social and economic process. Professor, thank you very much. Now I have a question at Jiri Orban. Doctor, can you see any positive outcomes of collectivization?
Difficult question. I would start with one illustrated figure that say that Czechoslovakia was only able to achieve the pre-war levels of agriculture production. So it means thanks to the history of Second Republic after Munich, that the last level of correctly measured was 1936 or 1937. So this pre-war level of agriculture production was Czechoslovakia able to achieve in the second half of 60s. So it means minimally 20 years after the war. For comparison, in the years 1965, 1966, the global agricultural production grew by 32% as against the pre-war level. In Western Europe, it was 30%, while in Czechoslovakia it grew only by 1% as against 1936. So just for illustration, that the original communist argument that collectivization presented as cooperativization means modernization for Czechoslovak farmers. And I think the presented figure clearly said that was simply not true. Of course, in later decades, we can watch some aspects of modernization. But still, we have to say that these kinds of modernization, I think we will talk about the decade of 70s and 80s more, were able to achieve also without forced collectivization. So in my eyes, the collectivization realized according to Soviet model in Czechoslovakia was not simply the way to modernize Czechoslovakian countryside.
Mam tu też do Pana właśnie pytanie o kwestię.
I also have a question related to
to the effectiveness of the collective farming following the according to the Soviet model. We used to believe, and we still believe, that the effectiveness of the collective farming was lower than the effectiveness of the individual farm holdings. Let me give you an example. I was in the past dealing with the collectivization of the eastern territories of the pre-war Poland occupied by Soviet Union during the Second World War, and after the Second World War they joined the territory of the Soviet Union. They were incorporated to the Soviet Union. So there were some reports of the political apparatus from the Soviet Belarusians of the Belarusian Republic. In these reports, we read that in the western territories of Belarusia that belonged actually to Poland, with the individual farm holdings, the effectiveness of the richer farmers, individual farmers, the kulaks, was 10 times higher than effectiveness of the kolkhoz and the sovkhozs of the eastern Belarusia. That's why so many farmers from the eastern Belarusia were escaping to the western regions of Belarusia to actually work for kulaks, the rich farmers. This shows a huge difference in the size of the production, agricultural production. So was it also the case of Czechoslovakia or Poland? I don't, well, we don't have any knowledge on the individual farm holdings and their effectiveness in DDR. So the question actually is whether the collective farming there was also so inefficient or less efficient than individual farm holdings. Professor Jarosz? Well, this is such a detailed question, so right now I won't be able to answer it because I just, wasn't, 1 hour ago you informed me that I was supposed to participate in the panel, so please forgive me if I cannot take all the questions specifically when they are quite detailed. So as far as I remember, I did not verify it against the articles that actually are somewhere here. So the production cooperative in Poland and its effectiveness was actually smaller than actually mid-sized farm holdings in Poland. So this is the information that I remember right now. It stemmed from the fact that the members of the cooperatives did not need actually to go to work. So when they were once forced actually to join cooperatives, they didn't want to work there, and they actually limited themselves to, let's say, consume certain loans given to such cooperatives. So I also believe there was a certain difference between when it comes to the effectiveness of the production farm cooperatives in different territories. For instance, in Wielkopolska region, the cooperatives were much more effective than actually in the areas where the actually agriculture was actually poorer, like in eastern areas of Poland, the agricultural sector was fragmented, and the resistance of individual farmers was higher against actually the cooperatives. So this is the general answer to this question. I know it will not exhaust the question. However, right now I will not be able to provide more detailed answer to this to your question. I know, however, by the way, apropos actually what you have said already about the reports from Belarusia. So I have yet another piece of interesting information here. I believe it's interesting. So the Polish farming during the Second World War, the private farming sector, actually we tend to say it's not efficient. The farms actually were scattered and fragmented. But when the Soviet
army, actually, soldiers were passing through the Polish villages. They were absolutely impressed by the Polish farms. In informal discussions, they often say that as compared actually with the sovkhoz, kolkhoz, the quality of this individual farming, even in terms of economy, actually, this farming was actually a paradise for them, if once compared actually with the life in kolkhoz. So that's what I can say about it right now. Thank you, Professor. Now I have a question for Dr. Jiri. You mentioned, sir, that in the 60s, there was a significant growth of the production of the collective farms in Czechoslovakia. So I have actually the question that I would like to ask about the efficiency, effectiveness of work of these cooperatives. What would you say about it?
Thank you. I would continue that question of effectiveness started already by Professor Jarosz. Your story about, let's say, perceiving of Polish or Belarusian countryside remind me also some mentions about perceiving Czechoslovak countryside by the soldiers coming in August 1968 to Czechoslovakia. In their eyes, the Czechoslovak villages and countryside and agriculture were very modern. But as I already mentioned in that figure, comparing the pre-war and after collectivization level of production, in the 60s, it was definitely wasn't true. I would illustrate it on the phenomenon of private plots. Because after farmers willingly or unwillingly or forced join the JZDs or state farms, they could have small private plot. It was a quarter till half of hectare. And at the time of collectivization, it was, in my eyes, very important because the production of JZDs and state farms were not able to produce, let's say, enough salary or enough products for their own members. So the farming private plots was necessity at the time for the families who joined JZDs. And the effectiveness of the farming from private plots were several times higher than effectiveness of farming in JZDs or state farms.
In Poland, the same.
Yeah. So minimally in that period of collectivization, so it means 50s in Czechoslovakia and first half of 60s was completely necessary to put let's say the care about feeding the family for members of JZDs to the private plots instead of, let's say, the profitless of JZDs or state farms. The question about modernization and effectiveness was in my eyes relevant in late 60s and mostly 70s and 80s, and it's connected with a huge, very huge investments of the communist government to agriculture at all. We can talk about machinery. We can talk about let's say better system of the state willing to keep young generation in the countryside instead of let's say advices of their parents go to the city. In the factory there will be let's say permanent salary, better standard of living, and so on. But the communist administration took so many efforts to keep the young generation in villages. So it's the one of the point I already mentioned. A huge investments in 70s. It was followed by a huge amount of new building growing in the countryside and so on. So to sum up about effectiveness of collectivized agriculture, I would say that simply the process of collectivization didn't modernize the effectiveness of agriculture in Czechoslovakia itself, but I already mentioned the phenomenon of private plots and huge investments. And huge investments we can illustrate also by the fact that JZDs and state farms were paid more for example, for the unit of milk or grain than was the market price for the final customer. Excuse me, oppositely. I would postpone this discussion for later time, for 70s and 80s. So for now I would stop my contribution about effectiveness and modernization. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie doktorze. I jeszcze jedno pytanie z tego właśnie fragmentu naszej dyskusji.
Thank you very much. And one more question from this fragment of our discussion, namely, what were the cultural changes like in the countryside under the influence of the implementation of the Soviet model? How much the countryside in Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other EC states were changing culturally? As we know, countryside was always associated with conservative patriotism with a high level of religiousness, attachment to land. These were the characteristic features of peasantry living in Central and Eastern Europe. So what did the changes look like, the cultural changes in the countryside, in the rural areas under the impact of the implementation of the Soviet model? Cultural changes. It seems to me that despite the collectivization of agriculture and the collectivization process, in Poland, peasants felt intuitively that the creation of collectivization or the carrying out collectivization is finishing, ending something that has accompanied peasants for centuries, a certain peasant culture. The threat is not farming production, but the change of culture, because this is a completely different way of producing, different way of acting, different philosophies of working compared to traditional farm. This is why peasants often were opposing, because at least intuitively, this they knew that this peasant culture might disappear. This is why I was talking about the unwillingness or dislike, reluctance of peasants, that because peasant children are escaping to the city. This is also the cultural effect of collectivization of agriculture. The cultural effect results in the fact that the countryside is washed out of the more ambitious or open to individuals. The problem is the development of education in the rural areas. The collectivization of agriculture and creating production cooperatives was linked to the pressure that wherever such cooperatives were created, you're supposed to create an infrastructure. An institution related to the collectivization of agriculture that was supposed to be the basis of functioning of culture in the countryside was a clubhouse in the village. This was the element of a new reality from the cultural point of view. The fact that since 1939 there is a fight in Poland with illiteracy, this is also related to the context of collectivization in a sense. Józef Cyrankiewicz, the Polish Prime Minister, at one of his public speeches said that we create the basis, that we are fighting illiteracy in order to fight the kulak, and this is our enemy, class enemy, because kulak wanted to have illiteracy in the Polish countryside because it's easier to manage people, to steer the people. The theme or the model of culture introduced at the time of collectivization today seems not modern, but at those times it was something new for the rural areas. This is not an accident that during the time of collectivization, but also later, peasants are not against culture in this infrastructural, in this cultural infrastructure. At that time, there are the basis of rural libraries, there are civic centers or common rooms or club rooms. Peasants continuously built school buildings, very often on volunteer basis. So what were the social action, what social actions did they undertake? It's not accidental that some of the social actions, voluntary social actions, were various cultural facilities, especially new school buildings, except for roads. And these are two basic objectives or goals of social actions in the countryside during the collectivization, after collectivization. Of course, we can say that interest in education in rural areas after collectivization is related to the promotion, social promotion of their children, although it was quite limited because peasants were not interested to educate their children up to universities. The most popular form of education in the entire People's Republic, Polish People's Republic, were vocational schools. So achieving the level of a vocational school was what for the majority of peasant parents is the quintessence, the essence of promotion, of social promotion. Of course, during Stalin time, there's a big jump, 20-25%. But it doesn't mean that they want their children to be studying. So this is the social advancement. Just vocational school after you finish elementary school. You finish elementary school, which becomes a norm in the 50s, and this a bit of a higher level. This is results from a certain peasant pragmatism. They understand that there is unemployment that exists, and the fact that they finish vocational school makes the children independent and they can start working. And this was what it was about, for the children to be able to make money, to be able to sustain themselves. There is a certain problem with religiousness. I'm going to speaking about that during the last panel, but it seems to me that what happened in Polish People's Republic insofar as culture is a strengthening of religiousness, and it seems to me this is a hypothesis that would need to be researched, that peasants during socialist Poland, because of the relations between the church and the state, got rid of anti-clericalism, which was present before the war. This was this mass attitude. In my opinion, it ends under the People's Republic in the 50s, in the 60s, but I'm open for discussion about that. This is all, just in short, about cultural problems. Thank you, Professor. And now a question to Mr. Jiri. Urban, how do you perceive the problem or the issue of cultural changes under the impact of the implementation of the Soviet model of agriculture? Please take the floor.
Thank you. Of course, we can perceive changing social structures of the countryside dwellers. We can perceive changing mentality and all customs. Most of them were grabbed by new communist ideology. For example, in Czechoslovak countryside, it was the traditional way of celebrating the harvest, finalizing the harvest. We can perceive the changes, cultural changes in everyday life. At this point, I would mention that, let's say, huge change of family-rooted relations and universal farmers into specialists with certain task and with working shifts. We can mention also losing the tradition of private farming in a family circle. And we can mention also the changes, cultural changes in the landscape. In this case, I would mention that the unified patches of farming land were created by plowing up of the bulks and old country lanes. Also filling of groves and alleys, filling up of ponds and meanders, causing the landscape lose its unique and characteristic nature. In Czechoslovakia, also we can mention that in the borderlands, newly resettled after the war, so in borderlands cleared of their population, and due to mostly mining activities, let's mention the sadly famous uranium mining in the area of Jáchymov, Horní Slavkov. Due to mining activities, a number of villages were simply wiped out from Czechoslovak landscape. Also, we can mention that together with churches, chapels, and crosses standing traditionally in the Czechoslovak landscape, the country, lanes, the awareness of the past and the religion of the people disappeared, thanks to let's say plowing the limits and ways between the fields. So there are, in my eyes, huge cultural changes, and we can mention them also in a relation with post 1989 era. I mean, in this time, the process of rehabilitation, restitutions, and some efforts to re-establish the tradition of family farming. So all those cultural changes lasted in Czechoslovak case almost 42 years, meant in early 90s that any efforts to re-establish the tradition of private farming, family farming in Czechoslovak countryside was very low level, very difficult, and even today, if we have almost 1/3 of agricultural land cultivated by private farmers, still that inherent or sorry, I have to find the right word. Is I mean, it's impossible to do not see that the Czechoslovak countryside is much more related to that cultural changes rooted in collectivization and the process of giving them back and returning to some traditional efforts, as I already mentioned, tradition of family farming is very slow and extremely difficult.
Okay, thank you very much. Pan profesor Jarosz chciał jeszcze zabrać głos. Bardzo proszę.
Bardzo proszę, krótko, znaczy, bo...
Professor Jarosz wanted to take the floor, just in short, because this is something that I've omitted in my intervention. Speaking about culture, I would like to stress the role of farmers' workers. This is a group which is about 1 million people, not counting the members of the family, and they introduce urban culture to the villages. They are, for the first time, for example, utensils for every family member, curtains in the windows. That doesn't exist in the countryside before. This is characteristic for the city, and it's going to be brought to the countryside by those hired workers. Thank you very much. Now the question to the participants of our conference. Is there anyone who would like to ask about something, add something to the second segment of our discussion, our panel discussion, please? Professor Marcin Kruszyński would like to say something. I have a question about the tractors, modernization, and approach to it. I don't know how intuitive it is. It is related to some materials that I've read about collectivization in Soviet Union before the Second World War. There was a report from 1932 or 1934 where the representatives of the authorities in the Soviet Union have invited journalists from Western Europe to show them an exemplary collective farm, and it's happening somewhere in the south of Russia. I don't remember, but it's not important. And the journalists go around this huge area of this collective farm, and they see a modern tractor that was imported from Western Europe or United States. It's left somewhere in the field, and they find something in a warehouse, and they ask the guide, who's in a very difficult situation, why this equipment is just forgotten, why nobody is using it. It's so expensive. There is a statement of an English journalist who says that an English farmer doesn't have an equipment like that, and the Soviet host answers, well, we simply don't know how to use this equipment. So this issue has prolonged my interest insofar as these situations and transferred it to the issue of Soviet education. I used to look at it, but I used to check what it was like in Poland after 1944, and this is what I am aiming at. At the beginning of the 40s, there was a deep reconstruction of the education system in the Soviet Union, especially higher education, because they put a lot of focus on training, well, maybe not engineers, but they used the notion of specialists. After 1945 in Poland, I didn't find this notion of specialist, but I wasn't able to establish that in the kolkhoz in 1944 there were any consequences for the fact that there was so much waste, so much equipment wasted, and I'm wondering if there are similar situations in Poland. How much Polish peasants after 1944, if possibly reach such places, how much they're able to find themselves in this modernized reality? Is this something attractive to them or rather diabolical? And if there were any cases, for instance, that someone was receiving this equipment, was unable to use it, for example, a manager of a cooperative, and was physically responsible for it or liable for it, and in the Stalinist times that we are discussing, it was possible to have the penal liability for that. So I'm wondering if there's a problem related to that, that there's equipment and people don't know how to use it. I'm speaking about Poland and Czechoslovakia, that we hide these problems. How much this technological modernization is only an element of the propaganda. This is one thing. So this everyday basis, well, dimension, collectivization related to tractors that could surprise, more surprise than rather than and the second thing, I have quotation marks from my own thoughts based on what you've been speaking about. And there are two words, giving up on the manor. How to give up on the manor, the gentry manor or whatever, the estate after 1944. As far as I know, and I was dealing with the Second Polish Republic, the manor or the estate, the aristocratic estate or the gentry, they were very well trained, very well educated insofar as agricultural science, and they would introduce some technologies. I understand that the relationships between the manor and the peasants were like right now between the private company and the employees. So you have to work a lot and you don't make much money. But from the mental point of view, do the peasants miss this old world, whatever this old world was offering to them? And was there anything from the previous world, from the Second Polish Republic, and did they bring any gifts of them?
Thank you very much, Professor Jarosz. That's a certain paradox that we're talking about, because we have quite a developed research on collectivization. However, when it comes to the agrary reform and its consequences, we know a little bit about the social aspects of this phenomenon, thanks to the research by late Henryk Sobek. And we don't know much about the cultural problems related to something that you actually mentioned, leaving the gentry state. I don't know any systemic research on that. I can only use some rudimentary pieces of information from some memoirs, discussions that actually deal with the gentry topic. And it seems that landowners or the ex-landowners, they actually got a ban to live in a certain radius close to in the vicinity of their ex-homes. So they had to move to the cities. So and they somehow were there were cases that they were supported by peasants from their village. So there were cases of like that in Prague, and this urban community where the landowners actually, while forced to move to the city, actually, were supported by peasants. So it's also worth to remember that there was also a source of conflict, social conflict in the, so the ownership from the agro reforms was treated actually, and for that we have really hard evidence of ethnographic research. So this ownership was actually treated as the worst one. So if somebody got land from a ranch, actually from the farm, that was treated, actually his land was treated in a negative way, actually. But in fact, actually, the land was taken from the agro reform. Actually, the peasants, they were afraid of receiving the land from the farms, from the granges, actually. But indeed, it was the fact. They actually got land from the gentry, and that's how the new farm holdings were created. So if in 1944, 5, 6, there was like 1 million of the farm holdings
no, doświadczyło tego w sensie pozytywnym, że dostało jakąś dodatkową ziemię, no to jest to
that
1/3
received
uczestnictwa
extra land, that
gospodarstw
was already actually, well, this is already
Nie
1/3
potrafi
of
pan
the
i chyba nigdy nie w stanie odpowiedzieć pewnie
farms.
dokładniej na to
So I'm not
pytanie,
able to
ponieważ
answer your question.
rozmawiałem nawet na ten temat z panem
I think
profesorem
nobody is
Epsteinem,
able to
który
answer
jest,
this question. When I
jednym
was
z
discussing
największych
with Professor
znawców
Epstein, who is
problematyki
one of the
ziemiańskiej,
biggest
stwierdził, że takich
experts
badań
of
niestety
this
jakichś porównujących i,
issue of
że tak powiem, drążących temat, który
the
pan
gentry,
tu zasugerował, takich badań no, nie ma, takich
he
systematycznych.
said that actually, he told me that
ciekawych
there is no
badań
systemic,
naukowych,
interesting,
historycznych.
scientific, historic research on that.
To pierwsze pytanie, pani
Okay, and the first question
Proszę pana, ten sprzęt
about the
przede wszystkim
equipment.
był w tych państwowych ośrodkach
The
maszynowych,
equipment
więc
is
on
mainly
był-
actually in
nie-
the
nie można
state-owned
by inaczej.
machinery
Sprzęt, duży
centers.
sprzęt
So the big
maszynowy,
or large
maszyny rolnicze, które posiadali bogaci
farming
gospodarze, często
machines
były zabierane
owned
im
by
do
the
ośrodków maszynowych. W związku z tym
farm
mogli
owners,
w okresie
these machines
PRL-u
were actually taken away from them.
kupować na własny rachunek
So
maszyn rolniczych,
until
dużych
Gierek's time,
maszyn
they were not able actually to
i
buy
traktorów również.
big
To dopiero za Gomułki zaczął
machines,
się proces, że często
including
stare,
tractors.
pochodzące z
Only,
PGR-ów,
well,
traktory można
it
było przekazywać rolnikom. Natomiast do okresu gierkowskiego
so until Gierek's
nie
times,
było to regułą, to znaczy
that
duży
was
sprzęt rolniczy, to co jest
not possible for the farmers to buy such big equipment like combines, big tractors, etc. So definitely this was not a process of the 50s or 90s of the 20th century. These purchases came later, and the farmers were allowed later on actually to buy their own equipment. So the peasants actually treated tractor as a symbol of collectivization. That was often mentioned in the memoirs. That's why they were so reluctant vis-a-vis tractors. So remember that many actually upheavals against actually collectivization starts with the destruction of tractors. So if tractor comes to the cooperatives, to this mass land, then often actually it's a symbol, it's actually object of the attacks of women, attacks by women, for instance. That's why the tractor was so hated, because it was often actually symbolizing the attempt of collectivization, and the peasants did not want actually to go for it, to agree for that. So let me, before we move on to give floor to Mr. Urban, let me actually ask my question again. The collectivization in Poland took the face of the woman, Magdalena or Katarzyna Ficz, I don't remember correctly. Figur, Katarzyna Figur, that was a tractor driver. She was really truly a tractor driver who used to work as a driver, tractor driver. Why she became a tractor driver then? Well, I don't know, simply don't know. Did she have a family, kids? We probably would have to ask Hubert Wilk. He was actually researching on this topic, but why she became the tractor driver, I can't tell. But indeed, she was a tractor driver. But back then, actually, working as a tractor driver, that was not very nice job. That's why there were not that many of the female tractor drivers. At least we don't have actually much knowledge about them. So actually, this caused this lengthy actually stay on a tractor caused many serious diseases like lowering the liver, etc., etc. So that's why women were not actually directed to work as tractor drivers, but there were like tractor drivers, female tractor drivers like Madame Figur. Let me just ask last question. In Romania in 1913 or when we were in Romania in 2013 or 14, you probably told me about the uprising of women against collectivization. So did it really happen? Oh, I was waiting for this question. I was waiting for this part of panel announced actually about the attitudes of peasants vis-a-vis collectivization. Well, it's still ahead of us. Oh, that's great. That's why I'm, in the beginning of this, just announce before we start next panel. So the resistance against collectivization in Poland took the face of a woman in Poland and not only. I actually took some time to find examples of the female resistance in Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria. So often the leaders of the biggest upheavals against collectivization were actually the rural women. Why women? In one sentence, they were more brave, more courageous. Oh, probably they often were pushed by peasants in this actually collectivization upheavals. Actually, they were pushed to become leaders, as actually others believed that it's less comfortable for the local secret services to attack women than men. So they assumed that a woman is safer in this relation with the authorities, right? So yes, and their reluctance was actually resistance was more spectacular. They were actually singing religious songs. They were throwing earth into some objects. So even the Secret Service agent raised in the Central European tradition, is more reluctant to attack women than men. Yes, and all the more that such secret agents actually were of peasants' origins. Iji, the floor is yours.
Martin, I will try shortly to react to your question about technological modernization as propaganda, because I didn't understand correctly your question about relation between gentry or aristocracy and peasants. And to be honest, I would have almost nothing to say towards this topic. So back to your first question about technological modernization. Of course, in my eyes, and according to documents which I have read and eyewitnesses which I have interviewed, of course, it was a question of propaganda, because after the campaign of 1949 and 1950, when the mechanization was confiscated from the hands of private farmers. The former owners, simply peasants, farmers, watched their original machines rust, corrode in the yards of the state tractor stations. Because there was a huge lack of spare parts, there was a lack of spare parts. Maybe one more note, a huge amount of that confiscated mechanization was American or German origin. So after collectivization was launched, was impossible to reach any original spare parts. So it was then a question of that propagandistic trips from the factories when the industrialist workers tried to help to repair countryside machinery. But toward the phenomenon of propagandist effort in the scope of technological modernization. I would like to remind also the fact that because you were talking also about exemplary collective farms, as I heard that in Czechoslovak case, just 2 months after the collectivization was launched, the Central Committee of Communist Party adopted the rule that in each district should be founded such a exemplary collective farm as a pattern to follow for other villages. And it was clearly not functioning, and after 2 years, as I already mentioned, Rudolf Slansky, who sharpened the phase of collectivization, they found out that the way for launching collectivization in Czechoslovak countryside itself is in forcing it by power, not by let's say inspiring farmers by such a exemplary patterns of collective farm or state machinery. So that's my remark towards it.
Czy ja mogę jeszcze jedno pytanie zadać?
May I ask yet another question?
To jeszcze jedno pytanie, bo jeszcze
Let me ask yet another question because we have 5 minutes left. Just a brief question. Gentlemen, tell me one thing.
Czy osoby, które
Do people who joined the cooperative farms, were they somehow maybe the following question: does the rural population treated actually joining the cooperative as a kind of betrayal? Were farmers treated as traitors? My research proved, and that was the research actually in small villages, actually in Kieleckie region, my research proved that the peasants really actually, that there was a lot of tensions and frictions between those who joined the cooperatives and those who did not join them. So also it was visible in the church, quite clearly visible, because one group was actually staying in on one side of the church and the other group on the other side of the, so there was this division. So this division also related to daily actually life in the countryside. Quite often those actually who were going to visiting the Soviet Union as a result of organized kind of trips to this model kolkhoz cooperatives. There was some trips actually. So those who joined these trips, they were actually, their houses were marked with black. This was an element of stigmatization of those who joined the cooperatives, or those who actually were involved in creation, development of such cooperatives. This was also visible during some kind of village meetings where these groups actually, the opposite sides that attack each other. So these tensions were quite visible in daily life. So definitely it sparked a lot of tensions in rural life, but I can't say how actually popular it was, or maybe it was just incidental, just ad hoc, maybe not ad hoc, not a single incident, but something that not very popular. But I believe that there was a certain mental tension. I think there was a certain mental tension. So Jiri, before I ask the last question.
So, Jiri, this is going to be the last thing before we have 1 hour break. Jiri?
Yeah. So I would say that mostly in the villages in Czechoslovakia where was very weak party organization, or let's say in clearly agricultural villages, not in the surrounding of some industry in the towns. There were such a situation which is possible to perceive like a betrayal or treachery in case of who would sign joining to collective farm as a first. If I've understood correctly, the question was about it, yeah?
Tak, tak. Tak.
Yeah.
To panowie, mam
Yes,
do was...
yes, that was the question. And at the end, I have one more question, and then we'll have a break till 4:30. If you were, and I think you were at the opening, the President Marek presented this entire line of peasants' resistance up to the Solidarity times. So could you, dear colleagues, present a thought insofar as the further resistance of peasants against the authorities, if they join the Solidarity trade union in the 70s or 80s. This is the same resistance against the system as in the 50s, because maybe in the 50s they were protesting against the mechanisms that were imposed on them, mechanisms for regulating reality, and this collective reality was fake, and they were protesting against this and not against the system, and we'll talk about it in 1 hour. And in the end of the 70s, peasants are more aware as participants of social life, and they protest against the rules of the system. Is there a continuity of that rebellion or not, Professor? And one more question. Maybe I'll make it even more complicated. Maybe there is someone who's in the 80s in Solidarność, in Solidarity, and he was also protesting in the 50s. Well, maybe there is such a person. I haven't met a person like that. Although I was examining only some villages in Kieleckie, but this is not the problem of research, of surveying those villages, so I'm unable to answer the questions. I think that these manifestations or demonstrations of resistance against the authorities, because I think this is what it's about, yes. In the 50s, they were completely different from those in Solidarność times. It's difficult to talk about continuity of social resistance. I think that the 50s were absolutely exceptional. The threat was much greater compared to the 80s. I think that in the 50s, it was about the existence of peasants as a social class, social group. Collectivization questioned the existence of that social group. They were supposed to become like industrial workers, agrarian workers, but similar to industrial workers. So it's a completely different threat. I'm sorry to interrupt. In the 50s, this is the defense of tradition, of culture, their everyday life. Yeah, the rudimentary issues for the functioning of peasants as peasants. Wiesław Myśliwski has written a wonderful text about the dawn of the peasants' culture. The 50s was the threat of this type, and them, as I've said earlier, were afraid of it intuitively because they never were fully aware that it's like that. So comparing collectivization as a trauma uncomparable to anything earlier or later, at least in their awareness, their life, Even with the Second World War, well, no, of course not the Second World War. This is an experience, a basic experience, but I'm speaking about post-war experiences. Sorry, Professor, could you change camera level? There was research or examinations done among peasants about the Polish socialists People's Poland Republic times. Which periods were the best and the worst? The worst was for them was the period of collectivization. It's not surprising for us. It's also not surprising for us that the best for them were the 70s, the first half of the 70s, which from the point of view of everyday life was the best for the Poles from the economic point of view. Let's forget the reasons for the prosperity. Okay, so what about solidarity and the trade union movement? I think that this is because of a certain crisis of the state, which is unable to fulfill certain basic needs of the agriculture. I don't think that this is in ideological categories. Of course, we'll speak about it. This is the issue of certain crisis of the state which is not fulfilling its promises, the state which is no longer able to work. And we can compare the state more because we are not as closed as in the 50s. I think that these are the basic parameters of the situation. And this is how these years are different. Well, the 80s are different from the 50s. Of course, I might be wrong. Jiri, could you tell us how it was in Czechoslovakia? How does population, well, the peasants or in general get engaged in the dissident movements in the 70s or 80s? Could you tell us anything about it? Are there any parallels between Poland and Czechoslovakia, or maybe Czechoslovakia is unique here?
I would say I already mentioned it in the case of Prague Springs in late 60s, that dwellers from countryside who perceived collectivization and industrialization as a project coming from the towns. Didn't trust to democratization ideas in late 60s. If we would or if we should talk about 80s and early 90s, after so-called Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, that was, I think, the topic for its own conference. I already tried to outline that the efforts to re-establish the tradition interrupted by collectivization was really slow and difficult.
Dziękuję. Panie profesorze, w zasadzie od pana profesora Wierzbickiego, gospodarza naszego spotkania.
Professor Wierzbicki, I have a question to you. I would like to, well, actually, I would like to give the floor back to you because we're over time. I know that Professor Wierzbicki had some problems. So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a break, a lunch break, actually. I would like to welcome all our participants and guests watching us online to return at 4:30, and this is when we're gonna start our last discussion panel. And Professor Dariusz Jarosz will be participating. Thank you for this panel. Thank you for all those interventions, for the time that we've spent together, and see you again at 4:30.